In the 1970s, an ambitious public works project, the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway, posed a challenge to the National Historic Preservation Act and the related federal laws that protected the nation's historic places. A lock and dam system of canals connecting the Tombigbee and Tennessee rivers would destroy hundreds of archaeological sites along a 5-mile wide, 130-mile long route through Alabama and Mississippi. For more than a decade, archaeologists from a dozen universities worked nonstop to find and study endangered archaeological sites and historic structures in the path of the project. The record of their achievement is impressive. Over 900 archaeological sites, buildings, and bridges recorded, several dozen archaeological reports written, and a detailed understanding of 10,000 years of human occupation documented. The largest archaeological project was at the prehistoric site of Lubbock Creek in west-central Alabama. On a tight bend of the Tombigbee River, archaeologists from the universities of Michigan and Alabama worked to retrieve the remains of the Lubbock Creek settlement before it was destroyed by a canal. More than 1,000 years earlier, late woodland peoples at Lubbock Creek and neighboring sites along the river lived in small houses in communities less than an acre in extent. They acquired almost all of their resources locally, ate from simple, drab pots, and smoked clay pipes. Except for the shell beads and bare teeth that adorned some people, there were few differences in social status. Although successful in hunting and fishing and the storing of wild seeds and nuts in large underground pits, the growing population was under stress. For late woodland peoples at Lubbock Creek, life was hard. Their skeletons reveal they were often sick with infections, frequently undernourished while young, and child mortality was high. Poor health, a large number of sites, and thick deposits of garbage at these places suggest that woodland populations were growing too numerous for the available foods. The introduction of the bow and arrow had improved hunting efficiency, but also increased violent conflict, as shown by arrow points found embedded in their bones. Soon the change from hunter to farmer, the threat of violence, and the coming of new ideas and perhaps foreign peoples transformed the river bend into a different kind of community around AD 1200. A new village way of life, known as Mississippian, took root at Lubbock Creek. The Lubbock Creek people's solution to the threat of violence and population growth was dependency on corn as a staple food crop, which they stored at a central place in a community of scattered houses protected by a wooden stockade that enclosed the river bend. At the center of the village, behind a series of log walls, the inhabitants erected a flat-topped pyramidal mound with basket loads of sand and clay. Measuring 160 feet on a side and 11 feet tall, the mound was bulldozed away in the 1950s. Excavating down through the remnant mound base, the archaeologists discovered the remains of a walled ceremonial precinct. The precinct consisted of a 2-room building with massive fire hearths and an altar. Analysis of the food remains and pottery fragments allowed the archaeologists to identify the purpose of this special precinct. The 2-room building was the location of feasts for large numbers of people. Concentrations of mouse bones, preserved corn cobs, and the foundation outlines of a special-purpose structure indicate that the walled precinct was the location of the community corn storage, a granary that replaced the scattered storage pits of late woodland times. The remains of birds with different colored feathers, imported minerals such as mica, paint pigments, and stone discs to grind and prepare the paints reveal that this was a place of ritual and regalia. Paired with the 2-room ceremonial building and granary was a single-room house, the residence of an important person who had a leadership role in the ceremonial precinct functions. These paired buildings were rebuilt several times before being covered over by the earthen mound. While all people in the village had access to the same stone tools, common pottery, and sources of food, some people were buried with imported items, such as copper ear spools, conch shell beads, and unusual pottery vessels. In one grave, the archaeologists found an adult man killed with an arrow. Placed with him was a copper ornament embossed with the image of a falcon and surrounded by shell beads where it had been sewn like a badge to his garments. Arrayed around his head were 12 arrow-shaped copper objects, fashioned as symbolic arrow points or bird heads that formed a headdress. Included with him were the arms and legs of other people, interpreted as grisly trophies of a person whose exploits in war was marked by symbol badges of rank and status. With this find, the archaeologists at Lubbock Creek had identified two leadership roles in the Mississippian village: the Falcon Man war leader and the ceremonial leader who presided over feasts, corn storage, and rituals from the single-room house in the walled ceremonial precinct. In the 1500s, known as the Protohistoric period, life at Lubbock Creek changed once more. There were fewer houses, the imported status symbols were no longer in use, and once again the inhabitants were less healthy. The wooden stockade was gone. Now a dry moat encircled the mound. Burial practices changed as well. The remains of children were placed in large cooking pots that served as burial urns. Instead of a cemetery, a large pit was dug to contain the bundled bones of 43 people. Skulls were separated from bodies and buried in pits. In 1540, De Soto's army of Spanish conquistadors passed nearby, and soon thereafter the Lubbock Creek community was abandoned. One of the largest explorations of colonial Alabama's archaeological past took place south of the city of Mobile on a small estuary known to the French as Rivière aux Chiens, Dog River. From 1993 to 1996, as the Alabama Department of Transportation replaced a picturesque drawbridge built in 1930 with a modern 80-feet-high concrete bridge, archaeologists from the University of South Alabama systematically investigated remains of a large plantation established by French colonist Charles Rochon in the 1720s. Here, on the western shore of Mobile Bay, generations of residents, European colonists, enslaved Africans, native Chato and Choctaw Indians, and eventually American settlers, raised cattle and crops and extracted wood, pitch, and tar from the region's nearly inexhaustible forests. When the French first colonized the north-central coast of the Gulf of Mexico in 1699 and established the little town of Mobile a few years later, they hoped to acquire furs and pelts from the Choctaws and other southern Indian nations. But after 20 years of marginal profits, some Mobile colonists, like Charles Rochon, turned to farming. These colonial plantations little resembled the more famous cotton plantations of the early 19th century South. Instead, in the Mobile area, grazing cattle and timber harvesting in the surrounding forest proved more reliable than crops. Excavations at the Rochon plantation revealed remains of French-style houses constructed of poles and timbers set upright in footing trenches. A simple barrel well, 2 stacked wooden barrels placed in the ground with tops and bottoms removed, provided drinking water near the living quarters. A maze of stockade fences surrounded these structures, separating household gardens from foraging chickens and pigs. The Rochon family housed their labor force of enslaved Africans in small houses, barely 10 feet square, on high ground across a small bayou. Colonists on the Gulf Coast began purchasing Africans captured from the Senegambia region of West Africa in the 1720s. Throughout the 18th century, thousands of these enslaved peoples were shipped across the Atlantic to work in servitude for wealthy French, British, and Spanish colonists. In the same area of the plantation occupied by Rochon's enslaved Africans, south of the bayou, archaeologists found evidence of a village of Chato Indians. Charles Rochon intentionally established his plantation next to the Chato village, and he relied on his Chato neighbors for supplies of pottery, corn, venison, and deer hides, and for hired labor. Several generations of Rochons and their in-laws, the Demoy family, stayed on at Dog River and adapted to British dominion. Choctaw Indians now furnished the plantation's occupants, colonists and slaves alike, with pottery, food, and other forest products, much as the Chatos had done earlier. British demands for bricks, boards, barrels, and beef to sustain the garrison at Fort Charlotte prompted increases in the Rochon-Demoy's enslaved workforce and in the cattle herds grazing on family lands. The revolution roiling in Britain's 13 Atlantic colonies arrived at the Dog River Plantation on February 24, 1780, with a Spanish invasion force led by General Bernardo de Galvez, who made his headquarters in the Rochon de Moy house before successfully besieging Fort Charlotte. Once again, the ethnic French family adapted to new colonial administrators. Massive trash middens in the areas of the family home and slave quarters reflect the continuing economic success of their plantation during the Spanish colonial period and well into the period of American rule, which began in 1813. After more than a century in the hands of the Rochon de Moy family, the old plantation at Dog River changed hands with its purchase by Adam Hollinger in 1834. Hollinger built a sawmill at Dog River, acquired a fleet of small sailing vessels, and directed his 200 enslaved black laborers in cutting and transporting wood products to local markets. 2 wooden tanning vats for processing cow hides into leather were the most impressive archaeological artifacts of Hollinger's operation, which ended abruptly in 1848 with a foreclosure on his plantation. Thanks to large-scale excavations sponsored by the Alabama Department of Transportation, in compliance with requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act, we now have detailed historical and archaeological knowledge of a major Gulf Coast plantation. The multi-ethnic plantation on Dog River is an outstanding example of a type of settlement and a way of life that was once very common during the first 150 years of Alabama's historic period, but which has since been almost entirely forgotten, replaced in the popular imagination by the cotton plantations of Southern myth and memory. One such plantation was located in the fertile lands of the Tennessee River Valley on what is today the U.S. Army garrison at Redstone Arsenal. Oakendale Plantation is just one of over 800 archaeological sites that have been recorded so far at the arsenal. In compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act, the Army was sponsoring an intensive study of Oakendale and the surrounding area as part of its plans to develop a new research park. The Army was hoping to diversify and expand its mission to bring more jobs to North Alabama. To get there, they had to explore some creative, efficient ways of complying with the National Historic Preservation Act. Former Redstone Arsenal archaeologist Bev Curry suggested that collecting oral histories and studying historical archives could help the archaeologists learn about the people who once lived in the area, information that would enhance their interpretations of what they found in the ground. It turns out that the Oakendale plantation site is archaeologically rich. Every time the crew cleared more brush, there were more foundations, more cellars, more old building footer stones. In one day, they mapped the ruins of over 14 different structures. But the oral and archival history was also rich. While Curry interviewed elderly folks in the community that had lived on the plantation into the 20th century, other researchers pored over census records, land titles, and other archives to piece together a vibrant history. Oakendale Plantation was one of the first major cotton plantations in the rich land west of Huntsville. James Manning bought the land in 1820, and he and his wife Sophia became prominent members of the aristocracy in the fledgling state of Alabama. In fact, Sophia's brother-in-law was Alabama's second governor, Thomas Bibb. The Mannings built a stately 2-story, 10-room mansion on their property and eventually acquired over 2,000 acres of land. By the time James died in 1840, there were 75 slaves living on the property. In 1845, the Matthews family bought the land, named it Oakendale, and by 1860, they owned 127 slaves in Madison County alone. Everything changed during the Civil War, when U.S. General Ormsby Mitchell pushed southward into Huntsville to occupy the city in 1863. Mitchell's troops evicted the Matthews, occupied Oakendale, and laid claim to the previous year's cotton harvest. The Matthews moved to town, but history does not record what became of the slaves. Over the succeeding decades, the land changed hands several times, and it remained a large farm with most of the labor provided by African American tenant farmers. Oakendale was farmed until the Army purchased the land in 1941. Archaeology has corroborated much of Oakendale's archival history, but the artifacts and other remains provide a sense of people's lives that the documents cannot. Post holes and a cellar pit representing one of the original slave cabins hint at self-reliance in the face of hardship. Occupation of the plantation by Union forces is brought to life in the form of a brass uniform button and a lead mini ball that had been dropped by a soldier. One of the more interesting finds came during a dig on one of the tenant houses constructed during the 1920s. Built into the stone chimney base of the house were 15 pieces of broken grave markers. 8 of these had inscriptions, including one for Peyton Dandridge Bibb, infant son of Thomas and Parmelia Bibb. This was the headstone of one of the children of Alabama's second governor. Apparently, the stones were robbed from the plantation family cemetery and used to face the hearth box in this tenant house. It's a small testament to the shift in the social relationships between landowners and the people who actually worked the land. Previous archaeology at the site had uncovered the remains of an African-American cemetery. In 1987, the Alabama Department of Transportation decided to expand an interchange near the arsenal, and the cemetery had to be moved. 56 graves were carefully excavated. Based on the coffin hardware and other grave goods, the graves dated from around 1850 to 1920. Was this the final resting place of the slaves of Oakendale? And did the descendants of those slaves continue using the cemetery into the 20th century? And where then was the Manning family cemetery? These and many more questions will be probed in the coming years as the Oakendale site continues to be excavated before being developed into a new research park. Because of the National Historic Preservation Act, we are learning about the lives of these early Alabama settlers and the transformation of a plantation to tenant farming system in a way that only archaeology can provide, through the things they built, possessed, used, changed, and ultimately left behind. We hope you have enjoyed this glimpse into the archaeology of Alabama's past, just a sample of the many people who have worked, learned, worshipped, endured, and rejoiced during their lives in this state. So much of what we know about thousands of years of human life in this country is learned through archaeology, and most of that archaeology is possible only because of the National Historic Preservation Act, celebrating 50 years of providing thousands of years' worth of knowledge.